What you're about to see is a story unlike any other. A story about this man. The man who saved Islam in Europe. Who is this man? Alija Ali Izetbegovic, the first democratically elected president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, formerly a part of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia? What's Yugoslavia? Balkan communist state formed after World War II, once a part of the Ottoman Empire. That explains there being Muslims. What about Alija? Islamic philosopher and author who was sent to prison. Oh my god, how did he become a president? Led his nation through the Bosnian War. When was that? Started in 1992 and ended in 1995. Between different ethnicities, Muslims, Serbs and Croats. Bosnian Serbs led by Radovan Karadzic, no surprise there. And hang on, what's this? The Bosnian War was characterized by bitter fighting, indiscriminate shelling of cities and towns, ethnic cleansing. Oh my god, I need to know more about you. Is this on? Okay. There was so much to unpack because Alija's life is just amazing. This story that I just stumbled upon is incredibly complex and highly engaging. I can't believe that not many people talk about him or what happened in Bosnia 30 years ago, especially today, considering what's happening in Palestine. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. It is downright criminal for Muslims not to study this man and what he had to go through for pretty much all his life. So how come we don't talk about him more often? And how come we've forgotten all about him? And more importantly, why should we remember him? I want to present to you the man who single-handedly revived Islam in the hearts of Bosnian Muslims, sacrificed his life in prison for saying, "I love Islam," wrote books making philosophical arguments for Islam, being the only possible model to live by, and lastly, led his people through a brutal war and genocide. So without further ado, here is the life of Alija Ali Izetbegovic. Youth and first imprisonment, 1925 to 1954. Alija was born in 1925 to a large family afflicted with difficult trials. His mother was described as a pious woman. At age 12, she would wake Alija and send him to the local mosque to pray Fajr to his childish reluctance. He would fondly recount these memories, specifically when the Imam recited Surat Ar-Rahman. Keep in mind, in those days, barely anyone prayed, let alone Fajr in the mosque. His intellect showed at an early age. By age 18, he was reading all the major works of European philosophy. That's when he felt that his faith began to waver, when he read loads of communist atheist writings. Back then, communist writings were illegal and yet very influential amongst the youth. He couldn't accept a universe without a god because to him, a universe without a god seemed to be a universe without meaning. Here you can see Alija's philosophical identity sculpting and taking shape. Around the same time, he came into contact with a group called the Young Muslims. Mostly made up of like-minded university students, they saw Islam as a means for Europeans to live in harmony and coexist in peace. But when the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, the Young Muslims were swept into the shadows. After the Nazis were defeated, communists came into power and the Young Muslims were once again halted in their activities. By 1946, the communists began to fill their prison cells with Young Muslims. Among them was Izetbegovic, sentenced to 3 years in prison. By 1949, close to 1,000 people were arrested in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and some were even killed. Izetbegovic received his first lesson in divine wisdom as he remarks, "One never knows what is good and what is bad for one in life. If I had not been imprisoned in 1946, I would almost certainly have been killed in 1949. Going to prison saved my life." The Sarajevo trial, 1954 to 1983. Alija was as stubborn as they come. Communist eyes were everywhere, and even stubborn Alija knew he couldn't continue down this path if he and his new wife wanted to survive. So he laid low for a while, working ordinary jobs while studying law on the side, whilst raising a family. By 1956, he had graduated from the law faculty and accomplished his dream of becoming a lawyer. But the writing itch was still there. He saw his people slip into nihilism and fall deeper into darkness under the communist atheist spell. For Izetbegovic, he was convinced that Islam was the solution that sat in the middle of all the rifts that we have encountered in the West. Whether it be religions, ideologies, sciences, arts, politics, cultures, and civilizations, Izetbegovic wanted Muslims, specifically European Muslims, to know that Islam was not so much a question of choice, but a need. It was after the death of Tito, the dictator of Yugoslavia in 1980, that the socialist states started to crack and crumble, which pressured the communists to tighten their iron grip of power. They began to introduce new harsh laws to silence dissenting voices like Alija's Islamic Declaration. But his real crowning achievement, the work that exposed his genius as a philosopher that went toe-to-toe with the biggest ideologies of the day, atheism and Christianity, was this book right here, Islam Between East and West. When it was published in 1980, it ruffled a lot of feathers, especially hardline communists. They issued arrest warrants for him and a bunch of other Islamic fundamentalists that were unknown to Izetbegovic. At the crack of dawn, the secret police stormed his apartment and searched every nook and cranny of his house. He was taken into custody, where he was forced to wait for 30 days until he was transferred to a district prison for interrogation for more than 100 days. It was obvious to him that this circus was nothing but a series of false accusations and trumped up charges. He was accused of conspiracy against the state and being the organizational leader of a fabricated Islamic fundamentalist group. The trial itself lasted for a month, making its way onto national television for all those who sought to undermine the social order to learn to listen. The only thing Izetbegovic confessed was that all his arguing with the prosecutor was futile, as he had already been condemned by the rigged court. Finally, he threw his hands in the air and went on to say one of the most beautiful things I've ever read from anyone in modern times. He said, "I love Yugoslavia, but not its government. I am not being tried for having violated the laws of this land, for I have not done so. I am being tried for having transgressed some unwritten rules by which individual power holders in our midst impose their own standards of the prohibited and the permissible, without regard for the Constitution and the law. By all appearances, I have gravely transgressed those unwritten rules. I therefore state, I am a Muslim, and so shall I remain. I consider myself to be a fighter for the cause of Islam in the world, and shall so feel to the end of my days. For Islam for me has been another name for the promise or hope of a better future for the Muslim peoples of the world, for their life in dignity and freedom in the word for everything that in my belief is worth living for." When it came time for sentencing, the camera made its way smack dab onto Alija's face. No words could find his tongue, no expression could find his face, but to only look to the window at the far right of that courtroom, away from the corruption and out to the rest of God's creation. From prison to presidency, 1983 to 1990. After the trial, Alija was sent to Foča prison to serve his 14-year sentence. He was made to slave away all day in hard labor, which in his words was both physical and mental torture. Being honest with himself, he says, "You say certain things all your life, you think it and believe it, and then comes that moment of truth." His values were put to the test of consistency and potentially dying upon his values amongst murderous convicts. He confesses that this weighed heavily on his heart. On the 1st of February 1987, he was unexpectedly summoned to a special visit by his two daughters, bringing with them a message from a senior position that Alija should draw up a plea pardon and he would be released from prison on the condition that he expresses remorse to the regime. Alija relented and did not write this plea. This reluctance was a huge risk, but luckily it paid off in 1989 when he was fully pardoned as a result of external pressure from the success of his book popularity. In total, he spent 2,075 days in prison. After taking a break from life by traveling with his wife and spending time with his family for a year, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The collapse of the Soviet Union and all that is related to it through communism is following through, including Yugoslavia. In all 6 republics, nationalism was loosening the grip of communism. Einstein once called nationalism an infantile disease, a precise description of what was taking place in Yugoslavia as old ethnic tensions had been given new life through nationalism. Izetbegovic felt that it was now time for Muslims to attain greater freedom. He set up a meeting with 15 invitees under the shadow of a mosque and formed a political party for Muslims in Yugoslavia. He moved quickly, taking advantage of the weakening influence of the regime. In 1990, he held a public press conference to announce the founding of the political party. One journalist asked Izetbegovic whether or not he would take revenge against those who convicted him in the sham trial in '83. He replied he would not take revenge against anyone and stuck to his word. When the November elections came, Izetbegovic emerged victorious and officially became the first democratically elected president of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In just 3 years, Alija had gone from sharing a cell with convicts to being the president of the republic who put him there to begin with. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ وَلِيَعْلَمَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. We alternate these days of victory and defeat among people so that Allah may reveal the true believers. The War Diary, 1991. Yugoslavia was on its last legs and was on the verge of collapsing. Alija had filled his presidential seat quite nicely for a year now, most of which he spent in countless unnecessary meetings with other presidents of sister republics, vainly attempting to put Yugoslavia back together. Tensions between different ethnic groups are at an all-time high. Izetbegovic had the added side quest of fending off Serb and Croat vultures from partitioning and devouring Bosnia. You know, like how Europe did to the Arab countries. There were simply too many issues to deal with for Bosnia and Herzegovina to stay in the disintegrating Yugoslavia. Alija knew it, and his Balkan counterparts knew it. He wrote in his autobiography that the issue came down to one essential matter. The individual states felt that they had no autonomy as a result of Serbian hegemony built into the fabric of communist Yugoslavia from its foundation. This issue, coupled with the persistent economic woes from a swelling debt and spiraling inflation, made things worse. So it was no surprise when the news came of Slovenia's independence followed by Croatia. This was a sign for Izetbegovic to get out before Bosnia remained a minority in Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. Izetbegovic was crystal clear that the process of declaring independence should be a peaceful one. Equal rights and total freedom for all citizens, no exceptions. In the next National Assembly, Izetbegovic proposed the idea of independence. Bosnian Serbs walked out of the assembly, accusing the rest of the assembly of wanting a Muslim republic. The people voted for a sovereignly independent Bosnia in 1992. The celebration of Bosnia's independence was short-lived, as the SDS Bosnian Serb political party forged autonomous zones, ignoring the government's authority in Sarajevo. Izetbegovic called it out as a direct demolition of the republic, a clear sign of impending conflict for the Bosnian people. This was the writing on the wall, and everyone could see it, especially Alija. But he was a natural leader, and leaders know better than to deprive people of hope. His striving for peace, justice, and freedom shines brightest in the last speech of that year, where he ends on a quote from a poet. "I swear to God Almighty that we shall not be slaves." The War Diary, 1992. 1992 was the year that Bosnia was reluctantly forced into the war. Croatia and Serbia had been going at it from the summer of 1991, and Izetbegovic tried his best not to bring his people into the fight. But unfortunately, Bosnia had been sandwiched in between the warring neighbors. Izetbegovic made sure that no one should feel obliged or pressured to fight for any ethnically related state. He maintained that peace should be the main priority. Meanwhile, Serbia and Croatia's leaders Slobodan Milosevic and Franjo Tudjman, locked in their battle, were sending their Bosnian counterparts Radovan Karadzic and Mate Boban to discuss a ceasefire. Great news, right? Well, not exactly, as they would only agree to a ceasefire if they agreed on a partition plan of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The only reason why they didn't do it is because they couldn't agree on who gets what amount of Bosnia. Looks like their greed was kind of good and not so good for the Bosnian Muslim. If that's not enough to keep Izetbegovic up all night, then maybe this might. You see, we live in a time where the UN has become so useless, it cannot stop a genocide from continuing, let alone prevent one. Muslims around the world yearly complain about the United Nations' broken politics and phony representation of humanitarian law. But here's what we can all learn from Alija Izetbegovic's story. The United Nations was always useless. A little harsh? Maybe not. That's because someone in the Security Council got the bright idea to pass an arms embargo on Yugoslavia, meaning no one can collect any additional arms during the war. To bring to your attention just how asinine this decision is, let me just tell you one statistic. Serbia was in control of an army so big, it had the fourth biggest army in Europe at that time. It had 6 decades of stockpiling from its communist neighbor, the Soviet Union, to thank for that. Want to know what Bosnia had before the war? You guessed it, nothing. Just men with light arms. This is what a Bosnian soldier looks like. So when April came, around the time of Eid, Bosnia's capital, Sarajevo, was swiftly surrounded and under siege. To draw comparisons to the siege of Gaza today, the siege of Sarajevo looked eerily similar. No food, no water, no electricity, no gas. Make a mental note of this. Here's another thing to make a note of. From May to June of that year, concentration camps began to sprout like mushrooms throughout Bosnia. Mostly Muslim civilians were injected into these camps, including women. According to Izetbegovic, the UN knew about these encampments and turned 2 blind eyes to these establishments. Also, your last mental note comparing Bosnia to Gaza comes from the bizarre fact that in 1994, a young man in London's Parliament Square. Are you getting it now? Let's come back down to the ground offensive. Izetbegovic needed to incorporate the help of anyone who could or would offer it. So at the end of the year, in December, he flew over to Jeddah to talk with Muslim member countries that formed the OIC. It comes as no surprise to anyone that these nations couldn't do anything meaningful to change the trajectory of the war. Just humanitarian aid to band-aid the open wound. At least, Alija took the opportunity to perform the Umrah and make dua for his people in the shadow of the Kaaba. The War Diary, 1995. 1995, the final year of the war and also the most horrific year of the war. Up until this point, anytime Izetbegovic brought up the question of lifting the arms embargo on Bosnia so that they could collect proper arms to defend themselves against the onslaught, the UN would threaten to withdraw its troops from the demilitarized zones, namely amongst them Srebrenica. He was well aware of Mladic's will and intent to carry out atrocities in the city. That's why he couldn't risk the UN leaving a vulnerable town for him to swallow whole. This was the only hope these people had of staying safe, and in the summer of that fateful year, that hope was betrayed. It was humiliation after humiliation. Mladic mocked the UN with attacks on UN checkpoints, forcing UN troops to withdraw deep into the safe areas. To restore its credibility, the UN announced it was reinforcing its positions. The Serbs reacted hastily before this could happen, so they took 55 UN troops hostage. The International Committee decided to not risk the troops' safety, and so they did nothing. If one can make the analogy of a bargain, then the UN made one of the most bloodiest and irresponsible bargains in history. Izetbegovic pleaded with anyone who would listen, writing to the US on the 9th of July to use its influence on the international community to meet its commitments to the UN safe zone. It's important to note, Alija used specifically the word genocide in that letter, but it was too late. On the 11th of July, Mladic and his men entered the town with no response from NATO. On the 14th, 15th, and 16th, it was a total bloodbath of mass murder. 20,000 women and children were forced out as the Serb forces systematically carried out a planned liquidation of young boys and non-combatant men. Satellite images showed massacres being carried out on prisoners and civilians. One intercepted call that Alija heard himself was a conversation between a troop and his officer. He heard one say, "We sorted them out yesterday." "How many? Were there 30 of them?" the other said. "Add 2 zeros, the first answered. In reality, the number was more than that. More than 8,000, in fact. In reading Izetbegovic's autobiography, I stumbled upon a little detail that made my skin crawl, and maybe will do the same to you upon hearing it. Before the massacre actually took place, after the letter had been written and sent on the 11th of July, General Rupert Smith, a UN commanding officer, called Alija. He told Alija that NATO had finally decided to carry out airstrikes on the Serb positions without delay. Hearing the news from General Smith, Alija was relieved. But that flame of hope was snuffed out as soon as it was sparked. He and his team were waiting all night on high alert for that call reporting news of the airstrikes, but no report came. It became known to Alija that the aircraft were in the process of taking off from the bases in Italy, but were turned back in mid-flight. Someone senior to Smith had blocked the airstrike. Alija asks himself, who is to blame? He answers, when a tragedy of this magnitude occurs, no one is innocent. Each of us is to blame for there being a world in which Srebrenica and Gaza was possible. Each of us must believe that he could have done more. After another mass killing in a marketplace in Sarajevo where 43 individuals were killed on the 28th of August, NATO finally intervened. 3 years too late, mass airstrikes came into Serb positions in Bosnia, and after that, the carnage came to a halt. Alija sat at the table of the Dayton Accords on the 21st of November. He agreed to a broken peace agreement, with the nation permanently disfigured by the Serb autonomous zones still present to this day. The ramifications of this are a separate talk for another day. At the end of the 42 months of hell and carnage, more than 100,000 people were killed, and more than 2 million people became displaced refugees. After the war, 4 years the war lasted, if you can call it that, a war. The truth is, there is no word in the modern English language to describe what happened in Bosnia 30 years ago. Slobodan Milosevic faced 66 counts of crimes against humanity, genocide and war crimes committed during the Yugoslav wars. He died in a detention center in The Hague from a heart attack before he could be prosecuted. Radovan Karadzic was found guilty of 10 of the 11 counts of crime, including war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to 40 years in prison in 2016 after years of evading law enforcement, donning the disguise of a bearded therapist. Ratko Mladic heard his verdict whilst hurling insults at the judge. Mladic was found guilty of 10 of the 11 charges, the same as Karadzic. This Bosnian Croat commander, Slobodan Praljak, whilst hearing his sentence, drank in front of the cameras for the world to see. Every single one of their legacies is sealed as being monsters for all to witness. Alija Ali stands among them, an honourable leader, free of such atrocities, honoured and respected by all. After being voted in for another term in 1996, he served till 2000. He was 74 years old and became frail, sick and fatigued. He voluntarily stepped down citing poor health. He remained beloved by the Bosniak public, giving him the nickname Dedo, which means grandfather. In 2003, Alija Ali Izetbegovic passed from complications of heart disease. His funeral was held 3 days later. Izetbegovic lived life to the fullest, not in the sense we know today, but by living according to his convictions and principles in chaos and peace, no matter what cause or whom for. He was guided by Islamic teaching from beginning to end and battled all manifestations of evil. Whether it be Nazis, communists, nationalists, fundamentalists, atheists or egoist maniacs, now that we know what he was up against back then, I would like to ask one question. What's our excuse today? Today in Palestine, we have the same UN, the same egomaniacs, the same fascists, the same ultra-nationalists, the same evil. Izetbegovic and Bosnia's suffering showed us that things don't change. You know, there's a saying, history repeats itself. You see, I don't know if that's accurate. There's another saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Evil may speak another language, wear a different color, occupy a different seat, but it's still evil. Nobody can dispute it when it shows itself. Evil is evil and it disappears from no one, not even believing Muslims. So if evil is here to stay, then so are people like Izetbegovic. Without a properly armed army, without planes, artillery, no advanced weapons, nothing, he fought with what he had, with what he was given to free his people of oppression. He fought with the pen, with his voice and with steadfastness. If he can do it, then so can we. May Allah have mercy on Alija Ali Izetbegovic.